Everyone has a copy of the document that's online, but if those of you that are here would like a copy, welcome to the public hearing for the Brookline Fiscal Advisory Committee. I'm David Kirshner, the chairman of the committee, and I wanted to share with you, along with several of the members of the committee that are here, how BFAC came to be, and we're going to ask your insights and opinions about tonight. So we started actually about a year ago at the charge of the select board of the town of Brookline, who I think were encouraged that a group of people who are a real mix of different backgrounds, but all of us share, I think, in common that we are all business or finance folks, but not all of us have very much background in the town or government. And so, me included, as the former CFO at Boston Children's, I did not necessarily have a lot of political public experience, but what basically we were asked to do is kind of tell it like it is. Probably chief among the responsibilities of the new committee, Ben Franco, who as a select board member was our primary liaison, he basically said, I'm going to let you do what you think you need to do. And we literally have been allowed to speak to or look at whatever we felt we should look at. And so what I want you to know, and I think, you know, in the world that we're in, is this has been without political biases about as much as we could. And that was our goal, is really to tell you what we think, how we see it, without any particular bias one way or the other. And so, you know, that's important to us because this is really about the safety, security, and financial, you know, success of the town. And so we took that very seriously. The other thing I'd say is the chairman of the group is how incredibly proud I am to have worked with this group of basically 11 of us. We were pretty much unanimous in what we thought we should talk with you about and put in the report. The recommendations themselves went through a lot of discussion and debate. Some of them are still pretty hot topics, but we tried very hard to get consensus. And I think you'll hear tonight from a few of the members of the committee who know a lot about these recommendations. So I want to tell you that I think we do have, you know, a fair amount of consensus around what we're proposing. The last thing I would say before we walk you through this for a few minutes is the final report, which is significantly deeper, broader, and heavier. It's about 35 pages, I think, and Carol has really been the primary sort of overseer and editor of this. We've all basically taken and will continue to take your input and finalize this report by the end of January. We are scheduled, I think, to present this to the select board on or about the 20th of January of 2020. So that's kind of the baseline. I wanted to just share with you about what we're about to talk about. So the ultimate purpose of the hearing is for us to listen and really make sure that we get your input. So that's what we'll try to do. And I thought I'd start with maybe a presentation, one sec, of the actual conclusions and findings of the report. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sure, absolutely. Nancy?
Yeah, Nancy Daly, former member of the Board of Selectmen and former member of the Advisory Committee and current town meeting member.
Nathan Swartz, I'm town meeting member.
Paul Sainer, town meeting member.
Peter Bleileben, nothing in the town, so I'm one of the virgins around here.
And David Kirshner, a 22-year resident of the town of Brookline.
Carolyn Vinn, Advisory Committee.
Arthur Siegel, like Peter. I'm sorry, Arthur Siegel, and lived here all my life. Mike Toffel, town meeting member.
Cliff Brown, town meeting member and advisory committee member. And who isn't here tonight?
Great, yeah, we're missing
Jeff and Mitch.
Jeff,
Minnie
who's just been taken away in business, and Minnie Calori, who, as you'll see in a minute, helped us with a number of the report cards, and she's in India at the moment with her mom. So again, greetings to everyone. We're very grateful for you to be here. 6 days from Christmas, we'll try not to be too Grinch-like in our comments here. So the next slide, if we could. I wanted to just start, Sarah, if you could. I wanted to start with the question that was sort of at the top line of our charge as we looked at the town's financial position. And I guess the astute reader of this, I don't know if you have the slide, Sarah, as well. There's sort of a graphic. And if you love the numbers, you can look at this in your report. You'll see the forecast of the town's operating deficit from 2021 to 2025. I wanted to start with that in the sense that we are looking at the totality of the town of Brookline, including the schools and the rest of the town. So at all times, as we're quoting numbers and data to you, unless said otherwise, assume it's the entire enterprise taken as a whole. And I think what we knew going into it, but I think it may be worth really thinking about, is that at any one point in time, the town goes into an annual budget process that's aided by a view of the next 5 years. That's the way it is now. The real question is our communication around that tonight, which you probably have already read in the press a little bit from the tab, is starting to make it clearer what kind of a challenge that really creates for the town. It's not a new phenomena to have a structural deficit. But what is different in our view is the magnitude of how difficult it's going to be for us to not make certain changes in the way we approach governance around the town and looking at some of the investments that need to be made. So as we're looking at this slide, let me say this. Our incremental challenge is about $3 million in 2021. In the budget year we're going into right now, it's a little bit north of 3 million is what we've got to try to solve for. It grows in 2022, just standing still, what we call maintenance of effort here. It grows to about 5 million, and then another 5.6, then to 6.1 in 2024, and about 6.6 in 2025. So what you'll see in the chart is a significant growth if we don't resolve the problem right now. So we're going to show you a cumulative picture. You probably saw there's a number out there that's 28 million, and it's the way the forecast basically gets done. Think about it as though it's about a $5 to $6 million annual challenge, because that increment is literally how hard it is to keep up with the costs that are currently in our system. It's just the nature of how our cost growth works in reference to the revenue growth. So anyone governing the town of Brookline just automatically inherits that. It is pretty much the way we step into the situation each and every budget year. So the goal ultimately is to take stock of that and then look at what we need to do over the long term, because oftentimes it's very hard, obviously, to solve the problem in 1 year. So in addition to that, we looked at the reserves, which are kind of the rainy day funds for the town, and came to understand how those are organized, how they're replenished, and as what we found ultimately is that those reserves are at, if not even slightly below, really where they ought to be by policy. And there's some discussion about the period of time it would take to rebuild those reserves to healthy levels. And what we're suggesting there, just like the operating deficit, is that we need to take a really intentional effort over the next 3 to 5 years to replenish those reserves. But by 2025, if you think about it as a bookend, here we are essentially sitting in 2020. 5 years from now, if we put our minds to it, we think we can put the town in really, really good shape again. Right now, and there's a document, I guess we're going to work off the narrative documents, which is fine. There's what I call the AAA rating chart. Some of you may call it the state of the town scorecard. I call it, essentially, the canary in the coal mine. This is a report that BFAC created, and I just want to use it as an illustration of the data and how we want to use numbers each and every time you make a major decision on behalf of the town. We obviously, I think, all know the town has a credit rating. And it does literally matter to us that we are AAA because of the economic benefit we get when we borrow. It's like low-cost borrowing. To the extent that you're a AAA rated city or town, you're in rarefied air. Truly, this is a really prestigious rating. There are 13 towns, which we'll see in a minute, in Massachusetts, that have a rating this good. And ultimately, what we thought about wasn't just the numbers, but this may surprise you, but the common ground I think most of us feel in Brookline about staying AAA. And the pride we all feel in how well managed and how well organized strategically the town is and has always been. So keeping our strategic AAA rating is a kind of premise, and that's the basis for this. Nancy?
Can you just explain to them how that affects when we're doing our building?
Sure. Sure. So just like you were going to do a home improvement with your kitchen at home, and you want to do a home equity loan or a mortgage, the lower the interest cost, the more affordable it is. And if you have a variety of schools that have to be refurbished over the next many years across the whole campus of all of Brookline, you want to keep that rating as high as you possibly can so that the borrowing costs are low. Vendors love it because they can trust that you're going to pay your bills on time. And as you'll see, it's pretty much the same towns we all love to compare ourselves to. So this chart that's here, I'll just use an example of kind of some of the ways we've been thinking about recommendations. This is a document that literally came from, I believe this is the Moodys Framework. It's weighted, and again, this is on page 3 of 18 of your document. It's weighted in terms of the 4 things that a rating analyst would look at objectively, and this is how the town rating ultimately comes together. It's a composite of these things. But the most interesting part about it is that the town of Brookline's AAA rating is primarily a function of its unique geography. Its value, its property values, was what drives the rating agency's view, if you will, the bondholder, Wall Street, however you want to say it. Their view of our ability to kind of take care of our debt is a function of where we are. This close to Boston, in this level of residential quality is really a remarkable thing, and that's reflected in the rating. Once you leave that's what's called the economy tax base. That's about 30% of the rating. You'll see that there's an area called finances, and that's where we've been focused as an advisory committee. We want to make sure that our governing leadership, if you will, is understanding and focused on how these various metrics get calculated and moving them and keeping them closer to AA, if not AAA, and many of them today are single A. So we've literally started to lose our fastball a little bit on the question of our fund balances, which is kind of our net worth. And part of it is this ultimate question of the structural deficit and the pressure that's going to continue to put on us if we don't fix that. So that's the second area. That's also about 30%. And you can see the pink, as it's been noted here, is sort of problematic. Yellow is worrisome, and green is good. When you get into the debt and the pension area, and and this is sort of to tell you like it is. I mean, you're going to see this in a minute, but for whatever reason, when we looked at the pension and what's called OPEB, which is the non-pension retirement commitment that the current residents of Brookline sort of have as a liability, what stands out is that the prior generation, while they made a promise, they didn't fund it. It's odd. They're not unique in that in any way. It's just left us with a huge unfunded liability, and it's outsized proportion to the town. So part of what's pulling our debt problem a little bit is these other liabilities that we have to retirees, and that's going to continue to need to be a focal point. The debt itself and the way we measure the amount of debt that we authorize through, what we describe here as debt exclusions actually isn't in that bad a shape, or at least up into the last couple of years, we actually were pretty lowly leveraged, if you think about it. We did the high school, we just approved Driscoll, so there's a lot more debt on the balance sheet of the town, and a lot of what this does is it sort of makes it clear each and every time you do a bond issue where you stand on this chart. So if you think about it, in an ideal world, this chart would have come along with an override recommendation. It's the kind of thing you'd love to see contextually to put all the ideas on the table that are important to the rating. That's how we would recommend that we look at it. Last but certainly not least is management, and you can see here, this has a great deal to do with the operating challenge of having the ability to meet your spending needs, whether they be in the schools or some other element of the town. So that's just a snapshot of one of the things in the DFAC report that has to do with math. It has to do with data. It has to do with what we feel is really important to the character of the way the town gets governed going forward. So I'll stop there. One last thing, and then we'll go to your questions that we wanted to share with you, and it's the next slide. So this is an eye test, but you can see the 13 towns. Brookline is running across the top, and do you see at the very top of the chart, it uses the same references that we used in the Moodys chart that I just described. You get to see the various credit factors that go into our rating, but it's now being focused on the question of how do we stack up versus the other 12 AAA rated towns and cities in Massachusetts. So you'll see there's a economics section where, by the way, we tend to do quite well. Our equalized value in Brookline is second. For reasons I think most of us understand, our property values have probably done as well as almost anybody in Eastern Massachusetts, and it continues to be a true strength of the town. The area that's called debt is one of the ones that I think is really interesting to look at here, because you'll see, at least historically, our bonded debt per capita is ranked fifth. And our actual cumulative percentage of principal required in the next 10 years is around 10th. So we've been taking on debt. We've taken a lot more debt in the last 3 to 4 years. The high school, again, big part of that. But this chart gives you some idea of how Brookline stands against its peers. And since we're all, most of us, competitive by nature, I think we thought this would be really helpful to look at once a year as part of the budget process and as we go through this. The last area, which is the area I was commenting on earlier around finances, essentially speaks to the question of how much these liabilities overshadow our financial position. And that's just to say that, we're dead last in unfunded retirement as it relates to OPEB. We are absolutely committed to funding it. That's a really important part of the structure, but you'll see there that, ultimately, there are other towns like Newton that are in the same position we are, so we're in plenty of company. But this is going to have to be reckoned with, and the question is, what does the generation of Brookline residents owe to solving this problem historically, and then what do we do going forward? So that's just a ballpark kind of view of what it is we looked at when we were trying to assess the situation with the town's financial status. very quickly, and I'll then open this up. I wanted to just share with you the recommendations in your packets were grouped into 3 buckets. And I won't gonna literally go through every one of them, but I'm just gonna sort of tell you how I thought about it. The governing financial policies are the bedrock, the foundation for how we govern the town, how we ultimately, essentially execute on the bylaws and the Massachusetts law that enables the town to exist. So as a student of this, what I realized is the law doesn't tell you a lot of things when you're signing up to be a town meeting member or you're on the select board. So these policies are really to take it the next step. And we did raise the bar on the next generation of governance in Brookline because we think going forward, to be fit for the future, we're going to have to be a little bit more data-driven, more analytical, a little bit more aligned between school and town. So, ultimately you'll see that what the rating really does, what it really does, is give you operating disciplines that other towns like us use all over the country. That's what the rating really is about, to me. As a former CFO, you're really looking at how to explain to the people of the town the disciplines that we use. And sometimes there is a decision that has to be made. There are choices constantly going to be in front of us, already are, that really require some way of organizing the data and organizing the information. So that's what's in that section of the report. It's about really common financial policies between town and school whenever possible. I'll just say this about the school town separation. We were surprised, some of us as lay people, that it's as separate as it is. It's odd to us because as finance people, it's one pot of money. There's one pot of revenue coming in. It's up to the people that run the town to ultimately decide how they allocate that money. But to not have both sides aware of how revenue is being realized in the town and then have a stake in how it gets allocated and split, at least to us, feels out of step with the reality of what we need to do going forward. We are not shy about the idea that the communication with the town has to improve. If there is one deficit I think we saw even in the last 24 hours in response to the committee's report, it's the need to put context around decisions and to make sure that everyone within the town understands the trade-offs. So we found, Cliff and others, I think were really primary in this, but that the town of Lexington, our friends in Lexington, do a fantastic job with their summit. They quarterly get the school superintendent, the town administrator, key members of the select board, whatever other constituents you need, to literally go through the budget process. There are agendas, it's organized, there's a lot of conversation going on. And in a busy world like the one everyone here is in, it's just essential to us that the advisory committee come to facilitate, understand what that communication needs to be about. The capital planning process in Brookline is also separate, a little too separate for our taste. It makes no sense to us to have a construction, capital improvement plan that doesn't also have to run lockstep with the capital planning for the schools. They're essentially, from our perspective, capital expenditures, and they all need to be financed, and they're all maybe financed differently, but they need to be viewed collectively, and we are in favor of a 10-year horizon. So although the financial forecast you saw earlier of 5 years in operations, capital is usually a longer view because it takes time to think this out and look at it. And so, in our perfect world, you would see Baker, you would see Pierce, you would see the whole thing laid out in collaboration with the town's existing capital needs. So that's a big part of our thinking and a priority process to think that through. I'll only say this. The Warren article volume has dramatically increased for those of us who watch you on TV. It's amazing. But as a just general citizen, I would simply say we need to be careful because some of those warrants are distracting in terms of resource time. Not that any of them aren't warranted, literally, no pun, but we were really worried about the volume and what it was doing during the last year as we worked with the town, and the impact on the budget and how that gets worked through. And you'll see there's a lot written in the report about that, and I think a lot of appropriately strong opinions about it. The governing element of the town's overall look and feel as a town meeting form of government was off the table for us. It was not a question we were asked to look at. But I think what we know is that part of what you would get in a maybe more formal structure is an advisory committee that's a little bit more financial. So again, my words, I'm a CPA. You know, I'm a CFO, not that everybody should be. We don't want that. But we do need a group of us around the financial issues in the town who dedicate ourselves to looking at some of these financial issues, separate and apart from just the warrant articles. And so the report goes pretty far to say there needs to be a change in how the advisory committee, which is chartered by Massachusetts law, how it should conduct its business for Brookline going forward. And lastly, the audit firm. So the accounting firm, I'm an auditor. I grew up at one of the big four accounting firms, so I'm a nerd about this. But it's interesting when you look at the accounting firm. It never should be the same firm for much more than a decade. You know, if we were in a publicly held company, as a Sarbanes-Oxley question, you'd have to change. In public governance, we don't necessarily make that the case. Further, there ought to be a partner rotation in the middle of that, somewhere about every 5 years. Our present accounting firm has been around for a long time. Good people, but you lose objectivity, you lose fresh thinking when you don't have an accounting or audit firm looking at what you need to do differently. And many of them are looking at other cities and towns in Massachusetts. So strong recommendation coming from BFAC on that. The other two areas I hope you'll have a chance to look at relate to the idea of multi-year financial planning. When we think about that sound way of looking out over 5 years of operations or 10 years of capital planning, I think most of us would say that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, we should. We can't see what's going to happen. On any economic development project that we look at for Brookline, it usually will take, Paul, I think, 7 to 10 years for those projects to materialize, to become revenue. Think of the Children's Place project and how long that took to materialize. Those are the kinds of things we're suggesting have to be plotted out and put into the financial model. So that's part of our thinking about not just the town, but the schools, in terms of a number of the ways that we're going to try to realign the financials for the town of Brookline. The whole idea of using that Moodys scorecard, obviously, as more of a sort of standard way for all of us to communicate about the financial position and the rating of the town, obvious. And then certainly not least is this concept that we maintain at all times a reserve. The unrestricted fund balance and the actual restoration of those reserves is critical for the town to withstand really turbulent times. We live in pretty good times economically today, but we don't know what life will be like in the long term. But what we don't want to do is not maintain enough liquidity, enough resilience in our financial structure to be able to meet the demands that may come. Lastly, we talk a lot about financial improvement. When we use the term financial improvement plan, and as you read it in the report, it is a term of art. It doesn't necessarily come, out of a textbook anywhere. It's just all of our experiences in business have been that when you end up having a hole in the budget like we do, where revenues are short of expenses, ideally you're doing a combination of initiatives. Town meeting is spending as much time on financial improvement as it is on new services. Because it's so essential and it takes so much focus of the select board, we're putting a lot of weight in the report on the need to think about how the town generates revenue, how it can, in fact, become more efficient, and the combination of those two things, ideally, happening all the time. So it's hard. When you ask people to change and really refocus, usually it takes a crisis. What we're hoping is that there's enough of a shocker here for most of us to say, the town needs help. We need to spend more time on it together. We all have something in common at stake here. And so what you'll see in this part of the report goes deeper than I want to go in right now. Some of you may want to comment on this, but it has a lot to do with the ways the town generates revenue. Those are fees that it can charge, the way it relates to its nonprofit, mostly tax exempt base, which is, sort of essentially what we all know, living here. Many of us work for those organizations. And the whole idea, and I'll give kudos to Arthur and Cliff and Carol, all of whom, Paul, all of whom are real estate people. We worked a lot with EDAB in this process. I can only say this. I think one of the most challenging issues for Brookline is economic development, but it's essential that we understand what that commercial tax base could do. Every 700,000 feet of commercial economic development we do pays for a school, a $100 million school. I mean, that kind of math needs to be obvious to, we think, the citizens of the town, because it's so easy to say no, but that's the bedrock economics of what you would see in almost any town. So let me stop there. Probably took more time than I really wanted to, but I wanted to just give you some idea of what the report really is focused on and kind of the key messages we wanted you to see. With that, invite whoever would like to give us your thoughts. And if you could just tell us your name and where you live.
Yeah, Neil Gordon, a Precinct 1 town meeting member of the advisory committee. I'm also secretary of Brookline PACS. I want to thank you for your work, and I'll tell you that I agree with most of the findings and recommendations, but I do have just a few comments in the order in which they appear in your preliminary report. First, we're concerned with the comment regarding advanced warrant articles only after financial information and ramifications are fully available for consideration. Who makes that decision? I'll ask, we'll call that rhetorical. Where, if any measure that reduces the legislative authority of town meeting and presumably cedes it to a gatekeeper beyond town meeting's control. We're also concerned with narrowing the scope and the size of the advisory committee. Those who are on the advisory committee know that PACS is not always the greatest fan of the advisory committee, but we're concerned. Currently, the advisory committee is the primary deep dive committee, and its work goes far beyond its recommendations to town meeting. Anyone involved in the process knows that between the closing of the warrant and the vote of town meeting, warrant articles are reviewed, they're amended, they're rewritten, they're amended again. It's a process, though, although not exclusive to the advisory committee, is fundamental to the advisory committee's warrant review. Lastly, as for the notion of an apolitical advisory committee, there is no such thing. No appointing authority is apolitical, and as a result, no committee is apolitical. And political is not a dirty word, quoting Marty Rosenthal. Yeah, of course. The current structure provides reasonable assurance that precincts, neighborhoods, and the like have representation on the advisory committee. Perhaps the new standing committee, I don't disagree with the need for deeper financial review and a longer term view. Perhaps the new standing committee with appropriate focus and expertise would be a better approach. Thank you, and again, thank you for your work.
Hi, John Hurst, town meeting member, and okay, thank you. Not a comment, but a question, maybe some historical context. Have you looked into? Do you have any idea what has changed? Obviously, in the I guess, recent past, the town was contributing to a growing reserve fund, for example. Something has changed that it's now drawing down that reserve fund. If you could just give us some context of what is different now.
Nancy?
As various overrides have been passed, the money was immediately allocated for whatever purpose was in the override, but the percentages would have needed to go to our reserves to keep them equal as we, or, to commensurate levels in the reserve fund. And that's why the reserve funds are down below where we think they should be.
Well,
That's just one reason.
That's just one reason.
Microphone, please. Would you have with the microphone?
Since 2014, we've been below our minimum targeted unreserved fund balance of 10%. As of 19, with a significant amount of free cash and trying to start making up for having been so underfunded in our reserves, there's more money proposed to be put towards reserves, and that gets us up to only 8.6%. So we have somewhat unwittingly violated our free cash waterfall policy by sort of skipping over one of the priority items in the waterfall, getting to 10%, in order to fund subordinate items, and in particular to get the capital improvement program up to 7.5% of revenue. In some years, we've actually funded more towards capital. So the reserves haven't been drawn down to directly help with the challenges in the operating budget, but have absolutely been passed over to fund lower priority items per our policy in the waterfall, including having monies left over for the Housing Trust Fund and for post-retirement benefits.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Paula Friedman, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 14. I too want to thank BFAC for its efforts and its excellent recommendations. I have a couple of comments. Recommendation number 11 about evaluating programs and services is an excellent recommendation. Anyone who has been involved in program planning, design, implementation knows that evaluation and meeting benchmarks and outcomes is a very important part of programs, any programs. And so I think that's a great recommendation, and thank you for making it. Recommendation number 7, changing the independent audit and accounting firm. Having been president of several national organizations, we implemented this recommendation, and it was met with, I guess I could say, shock and awe, but it's necessary for all the reasons that you said, so I want to commend you, the entire committee, for that. And lastly, I'd like to comment on recommendation number 6 about the town-school partnership. I think that it's a wonderful opportunity for us now in this fiscal crisis moment, if you will, to engage in deeper reflection and introspection on this entire partnership. I think it may be premature under the what paragraph to say that the TSP is not broken. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to investigate further whether it is an appropriate balance at this time. From many reports, the schools get more than 60% of the town's budget. I think it's a good time to stop and think about that and about all the departments, all the agencies within the town that need funding. I could name them, but I won't. All of them. And it seems to me, whose children went to Brookline schools, that over 60% going to schools may be disproportionate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening, Bob Miller, I live on Copley Street, town meeting member from Precinct 8. I would also like to thank all of you for the work that you've been doing. Appreciate it. Certainly seems to be important. I had a question about, this has been on my mind for a while, and you seem like a good group to ask it of. We have one of the lowest tax rates in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I have two questions. One is, how did we get there? And number two, is there anything, what role does that play or not play in the situation that we find ourselves in?
Okay.
I'll take a stab at this one, but others might want to chime in as well. I think that it's, you need to be cautious about just looking at the tax rate, because what you really want to be thinking about is, the overall level of taxes that we are legally allowed to collect, which under Prop 2.5 is, obviously limited. And so if you have a situation where your properties are increasing at a particular rate, but you can only increase your tax levy by X percent, then, you're not going to be able to necessarily increase your tax rate commensurate with how, fast your values are going up. You're really going to be looking at the total revenue that you're raising and how you adjust those rates between residential, commercial, that's, I won't say it's irrelevant, but it's not the only part of the equation that you should be thinking about.
Paul?
Yeah. And then I know that.
Mr. Sargent goes.
So I'll stand up here. So let's try a little bit of what Cliff said is right. Let's simplify some math here. David started off today talking about a structural deficit. And what he meant by that was that inflation on our expenditures exceeds the extra tax levy that we can get every year, that 2.5% increase plus new growth.
Nathan, would you pull the microphone over?
Nathan, why don't you walk over here and just...
Yeah.
So I'll start again. So David started off the presentation today talking about a structural deficit, and by that he meant that our expenditures on the school and the town side increase annually at a rate greater than the 2.5% plus new growth that we get on the revenue side. So a gap starts to develop. The assets of the town, in some sense, are the taxable assets that all of us own or we live in some way. And those actually do inflate at an adequate level for us to maintain our expenses. But state law, Proposition 2.5, limits how much we can actually tap into the increased asset values in Brookline. So over time, those increased asset values have increased at a rate that's greater than 2.5%, Bob, and that causes the actual tax rate to decline over time because it's the tax levy itself that's actually governed by Proposition 2.5. So our entire reason for being is your question. We cannot continue to tap, by law, we cannot tap the increased asset values that our town actually sits upon annually, and that's the real problem.
Thank you for asking that, because I think it's the question a lot of people have about the underlying appreciation in their homes. And I guess all I would add to what both Nathan and Cliff have said, and then let Paul finish this, is that, it's an interesting thing when you're sitting on an appreciated asset that has no liquidity, and then you're taxed on it. And so even though the overrides are the way to get at the amount over 2.5%, one of the things the committee's recommending the town think about is it's an override strategy, a prospective way, because it's the fatigue that happens with an annual override or the constant votes that have been sort of put before the town really are quite real. We're worried about it. We've talked to the underwriters about it. So we really need a strategy to think about when and how frequently we would actually go to the town and ask for something more than the 2.5%, to your point.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, can I just
of course.
one other component to the answer? wanted to sort of illustrate what Cliff and Nathan said, that it's really total tax dollars that matter. And let's look at this from the perspective of a small business owner. Of course, the commercial tax rate is 64% more than the residential tax rate. But we're hearing from the small business community that their real estate tax pass-throughs from the commercial property owners are increasing at a dollar amount greater than their rents are increasing. It's a real constraint on their ability to sort of remain in business. And the same applies to some extent to residents. So again, it's total dollars, not our tax rate.
Okay, thank you. I totally understand what you're saying. I was also wondering, in terms of overrides, you know, have you considered whether people would rather have a predictable, more frequent override versus an unpredictable but larger override?
You know, we have not been or do not consider ourselves to be an override study committee. I think that sort of discussion is something that really comes back to the recommendation that David was referring to, which is that the town needs to have a policy. We did not delve into that ourselves, though.
Let me just add to that. We are very focused on, as David mentioned, how rating agencies look at us. And the management component isn't looked upon favorably if voters start rejecting overrides. That's a real bad sign to rating agencies. And in my simple view, that underscores the critical importance of, as David said, demonstrating to the voters that we're doing everything we can financially across all 15 of these recommendations, and that there's a predictable sort of flow of potential overrides, even though we're doing everything we can to tighten our belt.
Yeah, I think that's the principle that we read about during the course of the year, looking at towns all over the country, where what we think most people want is like your cable bill. Just make it predictable. It's when it becomes unstable and highly unpredictable that people get scared. And so that's part of the principle that the group that is going to come up with the override strategy has to look at, I think.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'm David Lesquier, town meeting member of Precinct 11 and a member of the advisory committee. I want to very much endorse Neil Gordon's comments about the advisory committee. I think one of the values that we cherish in the advisory committee is its broad representative perspectives. And yes, we need to have the green eye shades, but we also need to be looking broadly at what's happening in the town. And what was just said is a segue to what I wanted to talk about. I've been actually to two of your preliminary presentations, and it's set up for me, first with the school committee and then with the advisory committee. And it's set up an expectation of a deliverable for this community that I think is very important. And David Kirchner, the chair at that time, said the key of what this committee needs to deliver is a communication of the town's financial situation, which few people, I think, know about. Certainly, when I talk to the members of our Precinct 11 caucus, saying that there was a financial problem in the town and the reserves are down and all of that was quite surprising to most of the members. Town meeting members aren't aware of this, and if town meeting members aren't aware of it, certainly the public is not. And I wanted to say that this is an important deliverable, but probably it needs to be expanded. And there were some additional areas that I thought the committee may want to consider as you develop your final report. I know this is a preliminary report. And for example, looking at a major source of revenue that the town depends upon and is quite sometimes unpredictable or unstable, which is the money coming from the state and also federal money, but mainly the state money. State aid, intergovernmental revenues needs to be a red, a pink, yellow, or green demonstrating an area maybe of concern. Economic growth also I don't think is really covered in the Moody's paradigm that you've presented. There's a question of the use of one-time revenues for meeting maybe ongoing expenses, which is I would think would be a red flag. And also something about the state of the town's capital, which is capital property, which is half buildings and half streets. Streets in themselves is an incredible investment that we've made as a town, and maintaining that investment is very important. And it's the kind of property which, if it's not taken care of regularly, the cost of bringing it back to an acceptable state goes up exponentially. And also, we've heard about in the advisory committee about deferred maintenance. That's another area that I think we need to track. These are areas that, along with underfunded pension liabilities and things like that, can cast a concerning cloud over the future of the town, and need to have green, yellow, and pink flags in a dashboard that will really give us an idea of what our priorities need to be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Dewar, town meeting member, some Precinct 3, and I thank you for your delving into these important details of our financial future. One question I have is the question of how you've discussed the concern and the crisis of our climate, and how Brookline is going to be prepared for alternative sources of power, for the MBTA, for sea level rise that can affect the edges of our town. And it's a important priority, and I'm not sure what your thoughts are on it so far.
So we need our house in good financial order so we have the financial resources to address those concerns. You know, we feel that it is something critical, just as critical as the infrastructure things that David was mentioning. And in order for us to be best positioned to have the investment dollars to address it, we need to start dealing with the things that we're recommending.
I guess the question is, if we can't deal with the forces now that exist and the unforeseen crisis problems in Brookline for climate change, how are we going to address all of them, given if we are in financially good order?
Nathan, do you want to?
Let me give this one a try. A good chunk of the work, actually almost all of the work that we did, was set up so that the town can make spending priorities explicit and make spending decisions under a paradigm where we can understand if they can be supported over time. So this committee didn't discuss at length any individual spending priority, which is really a political question. But what we are trying to do is to set up a framework so that the town can make better political decisions in the future, and to deal with whatever priorities we think are important.
Okay, well, I hope it will become part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike Sandman, I'm chair of the advisory committee and a town meeting member from Precinct 3. And first of all, I want to say thank you, and thank you very much for the communication that we've had back and forth.
Thank you, Mike.
That has given us a chance to listen to what you were doing and hopefully contribute to some of these recommendations. One of the key recommendations that you make is better coordination between the town side of the House and the school side. There are 5 select board members, and all 5 of them are here. There are 9 school committee members, and there are 2 here. That speaks volumes to me, that we have to do a much better job of bringing the 2 houses together. I will say that the very fine Deputy Superintendent of Administration and Finance from the schools is also here. That is certainly a good thing, but it would behoove the other members of the school committee to be here as well. The other thing I would say is that you made a number of recommendations that relate to the advisory committee, and we take those very seriously. We had a meeting last night, and the theme of the meeting was sort of a post-mortem on town meeting, and the headline was, "What the heck just happened here?" Because there were a number of articles that were passed that we felt would have a significant impact on the budget, and it's very disconcerting sometimes to present a financial picture and then find that town meeting doesn't listen to it. So there's a great deal of education, perhaps more than you may realize, that needs to be done in order to get all 240 members, or at least the majority of town meeting, to recognize the constraints that we're under and the trade-offs that they need to make. Thank you.
Paul?
I just want to add that Melissa Goff, in her financial forecast presentation the other night, included a slide that did quantify recent actions of town meeting that are not maintenance of effort expenses, meaning new initiatives not in the present operating budget, that is already showing a $3.1 million gap in the next fiscal year. That slide showed $1.4 million of town meeting sort of voted initiatives, not all of them mandates, a number of them resolutions, but in the past the select board had treated resolutions as mandates. And only $400,000, the debt service with respect to Oak Street is actually in the budget. So when we say we have a $3.1 million deficit, that's before an additional potential $1 million.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. It's the first time I've been here, so I'm a little nervous, but my name is Patty Cripe. I work for the Brookline Fire Department. I recently became a vice president, but I'm not here as a vice president. I don't take over till the 1st. But one of the things when I lived in the town, and now that I'm on the fire department, I noticed that we contract through Fallon Ambulance. We contract an ambulance where everybody else around us for years and years has been running their own ambulance services, which generates millions. It's not a little bit of money, it's a lot of money. Obviously, the fire department doesn't generate tons of money for the town, but I think the money that we could generate from it would help pay for us and take maybe some of the burden off the town. The other interesting thing is in Brookline, most people have insurance. So we're pretty busy. There's a lot of medicals. People pay to be taken to the hospital, but nowadays they're also paying to return people to their homes. So that's an additional amount of revenue we could be making. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's a lot of money we're leaving on the table. So there's that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dave Gayshock, town meeting member from Precinct 13 and a Heath School parent. I want to echo everyone else's thanks for all the hard work and great work that you guys have done to dig into this problem and come up with a set of solutions for us to start looking at this more systematically as a town as we move forward. I think that this is the start of real progress in that direction, and I hope that we continue it. I do want to, more in response to other comments that you've heard as opposed to response to the draft report, stress the point that I think Bob Miller made as well, and that is I hope we don't narrow our thinking so much to think that there's something right or necessarily good or reasonable or appropriate about the level of spending that Prop 2.5 allows us to do without overrides. Prop 2.5 locked in place with a fixed growth rate, our tax rates across the Commonwealth at a point in time in the early 1980s. There was nothing that, it didn't set an appropriate level per resident, per student, per asset, per anything. It just started with wherever the stack of towns and cities sat in the 1980s and absent an override, said we can only increase that incrementally, creating in large part the problem that you have been studying, as folks said. Override's not a bad word. It is just an additional voter approval mechanism for things that we as a town decide that we should spend additional resources on. It's an additional level of higher approval. We should do it thoughtfully. We should do it in a planned way, but we shouldn't operate from the presumption that the 2.5 level is right and an override level is somehow we're getting something wrong. It is, that's not how it was designed in the first place. To the point that was made, I think Bob raised the question about very low tax rate, and we're talking bottom 10% of all towns and cities across the Commonwealth for residential tax rate. Bottom 10%. We're like 28th from the bottom out of 350. And that translates to dollars as well. The Override Study Committee back in 2017 charted this out against peer communities, and our residential levy, so dollars, not percentages, per housing unit here in Brookline in FY17 was $6,300 per housing unit. Compare that to Acton at $79.94, Belmont at $79.60, Concord up north of 10. I mean, there's a lot of data in that report that we shouldn't lose sight of. It's not just percentages. We have chosen over time to tax ourselves significantly less than most other communities around us. And that may not be the right way to go going forward, and we should be open to that. That is in addition to the great idea about ambulance revenue, as a former paramedic. We should be looking at that hard as another source of a solution to this problem if done well and thoughtfully. There is nothing inherently right or reasonable about our current tax rate. We should use that as a lever that we can pull if we do it thoughtfully. I'll just close by saying also, as we're thinking about expenditures, we are 60th in the state right now, according to state DOE and DESE statistics in terms of spending per pupil in our schools, total dollar spending per pupil. There are 59 districts in front of us, and those aren't just niche, heavily commercially driven or vacation traffic driven communities. Those are communities that surround us like Dedham, Wellesley, Dover Sherborne, Waltham, Watertown, Boston, all spend more per pupil total dollars than we do right now. So the town-school partnership may have skewed more and more towards schools over time, particularly as we have seen increased enrollment growth from the late 2000s to the mid to late 20-teens. But that does not mean that we are overspending on schools. We may need to true up the town side to that level, but we shouldn't, again, be thinking in this box of we need to lower the schools down to stay within 2.5. So thanks for your time. Thanks for all your great work, and look forward to what the committee comes up with going forward.
Great. If I can just briefly respond to what you said. So I think you're right, Dave, that most of your comments, I think, were geared more to the comments than to the report, because what we've tried to do very carefully in the report, in the last area in particular, is characterize options that the town has. Like, one is to reallocate expenses from some programs to another. And then there's basically, it seems, 3 ways for the town to gain more revenues, more resources. One is fees and renewing pilots and things like that, taking a closer look at the fee portion. Then there's economic development, as Paul has already talked about, like how do we think about economic development and generating new resources to tax? And then there's overrides. It seems to me like those, and I think the committee, that those are the choices. And so it's not, we didn't view it as our charge to sort of put our finger on the scale and say we should do 30% of this and 40% of that. Like, I think we view that as a political decision that political leaders, many of whom are in the room, need to take a leadership perspective and propose. We're just trying to lay out what the options are. And we also want to make clear as the educational mission that if you don't want some of X, then it might mean you have to do more of Y. But again, where that allocation comes from, I think we view as more of a political decision.
No, and I very much appreciate that, and I think that came through when one reads the report. But as you may yourselves have seen, some of the more superficial, more headline-grabbing, more social media commentary, pieces have focused much more on the idea that we are somehow in an out-of-control spending environment, as opposed to we have a structural deficit that has spending and revenue-based components to it that need to be solved. And I think the more you can do in your reporting to stress the fact that it's a holistic picture, this is not a condemnation of we are living beyond our means and need to tighten back necessarily, would be very helpful to everybody.
What we also tried to do with this report, or with most of the work we have done, in the past, I think the first reaction when we ran short of funds is, let's do an override. And I think as a town, we need to expand the discussion around other sources of revenues. At some point, overrides will fail, and we need to have other legs to step on in order to solve our expenses.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Janice Kahn, I'm from town meeting member from Precinct 15 and also on the advisory committee. And I join my colleagues and others who have commended you for your deep dive into the finances in this town, which I very much appreciate, and I know that many others do as well. I am a little bit concerned about this focus on tax rates that we're hearing now, because it's only a little piece of the picture. Our property values are high, our tax bills are high, and tax bills matter as well. We're also a very unique town in that, unlike Cambridge, which has a much lower tax rate, has a much higher commercial base to draw from. And that really puts our town at a disadvantage, I think, that we have a relatively low commercial base, which puts a lot of burden on, frankly, on homeowners in this town. And somehow I think that it will take a lot of wisdom to balance the financial needs and financial stresses on the people who actually live in this town. So I'm under no illusions that there is a simple way through this. And what you're providing now is at least asking the questions, I think, that very much need to be asked and looked at. I am one of those who believes that we are one town with one source of revenues, and so to have the town schools split on a maybe philosophical basis or whatever may not serve us anymore. This is it was a practice that emerged in the 90s, I believe, and certainly what we face in this town now is not nearly what we faced in the 90s. And I think that, that we really need, I am totally on board with wanting better communication and coordinated looks at the finances of this town so that we can make sure that both the town and school side no longer are a town and school side, that the town really is a town, the schools are a town department, and we are a valuable resource in this town, and that we need to have a more holistic thinking. I love your idea about having the summits, bringing together the select board, the school committee, and the advisory committee. One thing I will say about Lexington, because I've done some research in recent weeks on different towns with a town manager form of government. Lexington is one of those. They have a town manager, and and the relationship there, I think, between the town manager and the select board is different. And I think it seems to be working well for them. So that's something also when you look at the management style of this town, that maybe a stronger town administrator or something in this town might be beneficial. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Good evening. Dick Benka, in Precinct 13. I would just like to ask a question about recommendation 11, which is objective yardsticks by which to judge progress against goals, review the programs, has it lived up to expectations. and just ask whether the final report will give examples that other communities have followed in doing this, and how this would apply to a municipal system. Our annual financial plan does include a so-called progress report, or how have we done on objectives and so forth, which can range from, we've sent out this many tax bills from the controller's office, which I guess is a measure of what they've been doing, to another department, which will go unnamed, that talks about the number of staff hours it has spent in consultations and meetings, which really doesn't say much about how it's advanced program goals. And I'm just wondering how this idea will get fleshed out, this idea of measuring performance, and whether you have models from other communities that could be applied in Brookline.
Anybody want to, should I take a shot at that?
Take a shot.
Okay. So I'm not sure if you've ever had the chance to read what was called the Citizen Action Group report that Ruth Ann Fuller and Newton helped draft. But the message in that report, if you have a chance to look at the executive summary, is so fundamentally at the point, Dick, that you were driving at. If we don't adopt performance measures, we won't manage any better in this environment than we do everywhere else in life. And this is a world where we really want quantitative information, not the only thing we want, but we really want it. So what I got from that report and what this committee has put together, to Dick's question, obviously we start with the scorecard that you saw. A lot of the metrics are going to come from higher level things, but I think our view is that, and this gets to some fairly significant cultural questions for the future, do we want every department in the town to have a set of measures, 3 or 4, that they select as useful, important ways to measure service quality, cost efficiency, things that can be benchmarked against other towns of comparable scale, 60,000 people or more? The answer in our minds, of course, is absolutely. We certainly will provide some examples of that, but we didn't want to take that away from the budget process, because that's so much what it means to be a manager in a town, or to be a VP, or whatever titles you want to ascribe to. So I think our view is that without those quantitative measures, there are no targets. Without targets, there are no goals. Without goals, there is no way to see where it is we want to drive, the town. And so it's really important, Dick, I really appreciate your saying this, because our view is that the analytics within the town, and we met with the CIO, he's wonderful, so helpful, with Melissa and Mary Ellen, who also have been incredibly helpful, and really thought that if there was one thing that would emerge from this discussion, it's part of the commitment that we have to have for ourselves as a town, is this analytical infrastructure, this ability to identify these measures and then measure them and provide them to the select board, provide them to the school committee in a reasoned way. So we will absolutely make some specific recommendations, and I thank you for the recommendation.
And some of those areas will cost money.
Yes.
We cannot build an infrastructure to help an analysis inside the town without having a new budget line in there. So we need to all recognize nothing comes for nothing, but it would be a really worthwhile investment that would pay back in the years to come handily.
Data without political follow-through is really not that helpful. So I'll use an example. And that is, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a big push by the Preservation Commission to hire more preservation staff, because they felt that staff must be overwhelmed. So that led to a dive into what the caseload of preservation had been and was, and what it looked like going forward. And the numbers showed that there was no issue. But the Preservation Commission made a big stink, and they got their staffers.
I just want to add that people should know that it's not just numbers, there's not just quantitative measures that need to be considered, but for lots of things that happen in town, certainly on the school side, there are qualitative issues as well. The idea, though, is that when you start doing something, you set up for yourself what your expectations are, and you give yourself a period of time, and after that period of time, you have to go back and be very willing to look at the data, qualitative and quantitative, and if you're not achieving your goals, then we need to be able to say, let's not continue this program. Let's not continue this effort. Let's take that money and redeploy it into some place where we feel we can be more productive.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pam Lodish, and I'm Precinct 14 Town Meeting member and on the advisory committee. I guess I have two relatively short questions, but probably have long answers. Is your committee group, do you expect when you issue your report to be the end of your work or the beginning of your work?
That's a great question.
I mean, you have amazing numbers of recommendations. They seem pretty solid. Many of them seem very solid to me, but who's going to do it?
So
that's my first question.
In the final report, we are going to be identifying which bodies are responsible for following through on these things.
We do that already?
Yes.
We do it already?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it'll be fleshed out more. So our charter.
Including former school committee members.
Thanks.
So our charge ends in January when we hand in the report. You know, how we will all stay involved remains to be seen.
So
Okay.
Carol's being very modest. She has a big Gantt chart that actually loads up the next 12 to 18 months. We haven't actually finalized that yet. We wanted to get your input tonight. But I think the point, Pam, you're raising is really critical. Who is it we want to hold accountable for coming back in 6 months and telling us as the town where the recommendations of BFAC stand? How do we hold ourselves accountable to achieving the three most important things that we think are going to come out of the report by, July or, September? Those are questions we want to talk to the select board about, I think, in fairness. And think about resources. The advisory committee, as Mike described earlier, we think is a key piece of this. Mike's even offered a subcommittee of the advisory to just focus on this committee's findings. But like everything, if there isn't a plan, we won't see this happen. So we're a little bit hysterical about your point that there is an implementation plan. We won't necessarily all of us stay together to do it this way. That's not our charge, but we will obviously provide recommendations to the select board, and hopefully they'll consider it.
And my second thought is, can this report include a roadmap with timelines? Like you need, based on all this, we would hope that you would do this in the first 6 months, this in the next 6 months, this in the next, because I think that we really need to be clear about where we're going and not have this report and all this work you've done get buried and not, we have to have an active follow-up to make it worthwhile.
That's the chart that David was referring to. We'll be laying out those expectations.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Davis, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 10. First, I want to echo what everybody has said about what a terrific job you folks have done and how much work and thought you have put into it, and thank you. I have a question that forgive me if it's maybe it's not at a sufficiently high level, but I am curious about, is there a role for public subscription for certain kinds, perhaps identified capital projects? In other words, by public subscription, I mean maybe they don't get billed until a certain level of public volunteer money has actually been put into it. Is there a role for that, or is it too small potatoes?
no idea.
I don't know. That's a good question. We'll have to take that under consideration. Thanks for your question.
Hi. Ditto on all the compliments. Make it brief. I'm Regina Frawley. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 16 and a long-time observer of the budget process, the Board of Selectmen, and the Advisory Committee. My background in education is in graduate school, was the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I've unlearned the layman's definition of diplomacy. It's not making nice. It's frank and open discussions. If you have to shut the door, you shut the door, but you've got to get to the heart of what the special interests are that you represent. So I don't think that part of what I've been observing forever, for 20 years, is the niceness. Make nice. Don't name names. Don't be too aggressive. We're in trouble. You say it. Your report says it. We have to act as if we're in trouble. So I've watched the school budget get top-heavy. Now, my training looked at the Pentagon budget. I swear to you, they're identical formatting, the paradigm. You fatten it up, you bloat it, and if nobody really screams, you keep it that way, and you come into something called relative deprivation. People reduce their workload, and they resent very much if you say, no, we're going to cut one of you out, and you have to do more. So we've had many critiques, many town meeting members, some not present in this room now, others, including me, observing that you've added another top-heavy six-figure salary in the budget. Last year, there were 2 added. When it was questioned in my presence, what are they for? Administration of the schools? Well, we don't know yet. They're placeholders. We'll find something for it. Now, that's one hell of a way to do your budget. And nobody objected. The advisory committee allowed that. Nobody makes unnice. Nobody is frank and open and confrontational about it. The fees issue is an issue for seniors in particular, the most vulnerable members of this community. I go back to the 60s. I moved in the 60s. Believe it or not, there was no deficit back in the early 60s. The budget was balanced. You didn't have the money, you didn't do it. And that was the mentality that came out of the Depression for many people, and people were very happy with that attitude. So they were willing to live with less than the state-of-the-art kind of thing. I've watched it increase. Fees, many of you haven't lived here long enough. You've lived here only when things are the way they are. Fees for sewer were in your taxes. Garbage pickup was in your taxes. You got to write it off on your income tax. They're not any longer. They're pretty maxed out. We pay for a water meter in our homes, $240 a year, and you're probably going to recommend raising it. It sounds like Mike Toffel has no problem with that. And what happens, yeah, I heard you, Mike. And the problem is the demographics of town meeting have very shifted, and people who can afford to move into Brookline now have deeper pockets, but the longtime residents are on very low. The older you are, you lower your pension, lower your Social Security. It just wasn't the same amount of money. So if somebody used the word holistic, you have to factor in the decision-making that you make monetarily to make it look just like a good budget. Column A matches column B, expense, costs, income. You have to realize the impact you're doing to the most vulnerable people in this town who have paid to date to make the town what it is. The other thing I heard tonight implicitly is, again, from maybe the younger generation with deeper pockets, is an override just becomes your way of balancing the budget. That's a very bad policy for governance. It's the beginning of a complete stratification of who can afford to live here and who's forced out. etc. So I don't agree with that whatsoever. You really have to, in part of your reports, in my very strong opinion, you have to put a limit on what you think the market really will bear over that 5 and 10-year projection that you're looking at. You just can't be ad infinitum, and you can't keep blaming the Prop 2.5. We lived very well with it for a long time. So finally, just as a little defense of Powers and Sullivan, and I have no conflict of interest. I'm far from being an accountant. I have been in this room and had 1 year in particular heard the presenter beg the board of sitting board of selectmen, please do something about the OPEBs. And they weren't done until the less than 10 years. So, you know, I think what Pam was getting at is you've got to have a metric that actually recommends strongly the design of how this is ever going to be implemented. You have to factor in people who are not wealthy enough to continue to live in the town, even though they've been here for 50 years, as I have. You have to balance a bit of the social contract, that nasty little word nobody seems to remember anymore. We had a social contract. It's being changed in order to find new ways, new fees, new ways of paying the bills, when in fact there has to be a great big scissors, and you have to recommend how that scissors is going to be implemented. I do recommend starting with the school department. Thank you.
So I do just want to correct the record. In fact, I said exactly the opposite of what you said I said. I said, well, I just want to be clear. I said we are not actually taking a position on how much the town should rely on fees, economic development, and overrides, but we are laying out those as the choices and view it as our educational role to point out to town meeting members and the public that if you want less of one, it likely means you're going to have to rely more on the others. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to point out is, like, it's been a little bit loose the way people have been using the word deficits. Like, the town is not allowed to have a deficit, right? These are deficits in our projections, but every year we must balance the budget. So those are two different things. I just wanted to make sure we're clear on those.
Ditto the thanks once again. John Van Scoik, town meeting member from Precinct 13 and advisory committee member. I would like to underscore something that is implicit in your report, but I think needs to be brought more to the surface and emphasized. It's one thing to have correctly pointed out that we actually have not been meeting our goals in terms of reserves, and maybe not meeting our goals in terms of fully funding OPEBs and pensions. But the question that I think is equally important is when you consider that every year the budget process begins with a financial plan this thick, and then goes through weeks and weeks and weeks of review by committee after committee after committee after committee, and then goes to town meeting in a document that's this thick, and then gets adopted, and never in that process are people made aware that we're not even doing what we said we would do about funding of reserves. We're not even on track to meet the goals that we said we were going to meet in terms of funding of the unfunded pension liability and the unfunded OPEB liability. How could that happen? How could we have an advisory committee whose charge is to make the town aware of these kinds of issues, but it isn't even apparent to the advisory committee when they go through the financial plan that this is what's happening? I mean, truly, the question I've heard more often than any other question since you began to gather, some attention for your work is people come saying, I don't get it. I thought we were taking care of that. I thought we were taking care of the pension issue. I thought we were taking care of the OPEB issue. I thought we had a policy on reserves. So how does that happen? And I'm not asking you to answer it now. I'm just saying it to me is maybe the most important part of this process we're going through right now. I was thinking last night as we were reorganizing, we were licking our wounds on the advisory committee after town meeting, kind of feeling like, maybe we didn't really do our job because we could see things happening at town meeting that were just completely out of sync with good fiscal and financial and budgetary practice. I mean, people jumping the line arbitrarily at a town meeting and suddenly saying, I want to grab some money from the budget for this, and I want to grab some money from the budget for that, without ever having to even explain where is the money going to come from, who's going to have to get less as a result of this. So we're meeting and we're trying to sort of figure out how did that happen. Did anyone get the number on that truck that ran over us? And I'm thinking, can we say with any confidence right now, as an advisory committee, that if, for example, some of the, warning flags that you folks have seen sort of within the text of the rating agency reports on us, if it should turn out that 5 years from now we do lose, we suffer a downgrade in our bond ratings, is the advisory committee going to say, we didn't see that coming? Is town meeting going to say, we didn't see that coming? How did that happen? Right now, what we're saying is, we didn't see this reserves thing coming. We didn't see the OPEB thing happening. We didn't see the pension thing happening. How do we change our processes so that we will see these things coming and act on them? So I think that's the big challenge that this report poses for the town of Brookline. Thank you.
Nathan, do you want to, John, just before you?
I actually do want to address that. So John, this is actually something that we have discussed at length, and we don't yet have a recommendation. But I will say that the range of recommendations has gone all the way from completely unattainable, according to David, because I went too far on this one. But there's got to be, at least in my opinion, although I'm speaking only for myself here, which is why I came over here, there's got to be some sort of, if not certification, some sort of identification of the most important policies that we say that we adhere to, that's listed somewhere in the budget book that says, did we achieve it with this budget going forward, or did we not, so that we can highlight this for all users of the budget book. I can't take questions from here, so.
Go ahead.
I just want to know, what a policy that you
Lieutenant Pike.
want a policy that we have. Oh, sorry, I'm Ellen Schoner. I'm just living in precinct 12. Wouldn't a policy that's not being followed, shouldn't that be brought up in the audit committee? Was that not in the audit report?
It ought to be, and that's the essence of part of what I want to say is that this goes back to John's point. The warning signs that we showed you in the Moodys scorecard have been visually put into things like pink and yellow. I could imagine that almost anybody here would pretty quickly understand we are way off of AAA behavior. You can see that. I can't be more explicit than that. But when you violate your own policies, That's a violation of what we would describe as internal control. That goes back to the point that was made earlier. Nathan was saying, you know, in a Sarbanes-Oxley world, in a public world where you have to do a SOX review for the shareholder of your public debt or your public equity, someone would sign that off. And I said, damn, I think that's overkill for Brookline. We don't need to do that, do we? He said, yeah, I think we do. So, you know, we haven't made a decision about that, but I guess what some of you were saying is, you need to hit us with a 2x4. We're all too busy, and we're all assuming things are happening. So maybe what we need to do, and there will be, assuming that you're in agreement and the select board adopts it, there will be a new audit firm that's appointed through an RFP process. And one of the things I think you would probably want in an RFP process is an audit report or some sort of side letter that speaks to these fundamental metrics that you're describing as sort of givens. We can't imagine a world where we're not maintaining at least 10% of our $330 million of revenue in 2022. I mean, how many of us even know how it's calculated? I mean, talk about candor. It has literally taken us many, many meetings to get clarity on the numerator and the denominator. That should not be the case. We should know exactly how it's being calculated by Moody's, by S&P, and by us in our own policies. There should be really no difference. Part of the question, if I may say, one of the select board members asked me at the very beginning of the process, because we got a chance to meet with every one of them, which was fantastic, was when we issue the debt, that's one thing. But how do we know we're still in compliance with it? We don't necessarily have covenants like you would in a mortgage or in a debt structure all the time, but the principle's the same thing that you're saying. Normally, we would bring to a finance committee our debt covenants to say we're in compliance or we're off and here's what we're going to do about it. None of that's been happening. That was identified very early on as a deficit in the process. That gets back to the questions that were raised about public disclosure and being explicit, not just with the select board, but the entire town about this. That's why we're putting the Brookline scorecard for Moody's up as an example of something that everybody would get. We're not saying that's 6 people or 10 people or 200 people. Every one of the 60,000 people we're responsible for should know the town's conducting its business in a compliant way. That's important. It's integrity. It's how we govern. That's someone's diplomacy comment earlier. The only way we do conflict resolution is if, and I'll just sort of summarize it if there aren't any other questions tonight, I appreciate everyone's time, is the conflict resolution is probably the most important thing that we can do. And the best way for us to do that is with good, clear, honest information. Because that at least settles what, you know, is the truth, which is so hard to find. We want Brookline to be that. That's how proud we are of who we are in Brookline. You know, being a AAA rated entity has everything to do with that. It has everything to do with that integrity, that the data and the policies are being adhered to. So we hear you loud and clear. And I went a little longer than I wanted to on this, but it is so much the essence of what I think the select board really wants and wanted from us. You know, if you tell it like it is, there's a lot of data that nobody gets to see clearly here. You know, if and we can speculate about why that is and how it is. But when Dick says we want the metrics, or Mike is saying we want the metrics to go to the advisory committee, I'm assuming that means whatever the metrics you think you want, whatever we think is a good idea, you're going to get. And that's why it's just really important to just be explicit, I think, about that, because that's the town we all moved into. Some of us 50 years ago, some of us 25, some of us yesterday. So, any other questions, thoughts?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ruth Ann Snyder. I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 6. And I feel overwhelmed by everything I've heard this evening. And I don't even know if my remarks are relevant at this point. But having trudged over here, I'm going to deliver them.
Please.
Good evening. And thank you all for trudging over here on this very cold, miserable night, too. So I'm just thinking about honest revenue streams and resources for the town. And I'm picking up on what the woman said about or somebody said about the streets, and I have a concern about the e-scooters, but I think it's a larger application, if it makes sense at all. And so the population of people that will use e-scooters are at risk because our streets are in very poor condition. And so I think it's important for the e-scooter companies as well as it is for us to repair our roads. And I'm wondering if it's fair to ask, not even fair, if we have the authority to ask them to make an annual contribution or donation, whatever the correct language is, to help repair our roads. And the intersection that I see there is, and I know there are lawyers in the room that love to ask, but the intersection of at-risk and negligence, it serves us both well to keep our roads in good repair. And so I think that they would be pleased to help do that. And so I think I'm talking about a corporate public partnership. I don't know what the language is, but I think it's time to invite the people who benefit and prosper from our prosperous community to help us support it. And I think that there's a model in the marijuana clinic that's giving something towards mitigation funds. And initially it was set up for the police department, but I could see it going, the funds being generated towards the Brookline mental health community. I can see it be generated towards education in the schools about the product that they're selling, that our kids are getting exposed to. I can see spreading their money around. I can see spending Welltower's annual contribution to the well-being of the town, that it's joining in the community, spent for supporting senior tax relief and supporting the senior center. I think that we have to build working alliances, I'm not sure the language, with those members of our community that will prosper as the community prospers. Their businesses will. So those are my remarks.
Thank you. Any other comments?
My name is Roger Blood. A question about, just listening to the discussion and especially the part about the role of overrides in the future and how we should look at them, and especially reflecting on Dave Gesiak's comments about possibly thinking about them differently. The current and recent way, or really over a period of years, that overrides are offered to the voters has been, here's what's being asked, here's what you'll get for the extra taxes, here's what will happen or you won't get if you don't pass it, period, pretty much. And if your approach, which makes a lot of sense to me, to take a longer term view of the town's future needs, and if there's a finding that the closing the deficit and the future needs for revenues exceeds the statutory limitations for Prop 2.5, that, and I'm kind of putting this in, I want to put it in the way of a question, so that future overrides would be offered by the town in more of an official way or a standardized way, what people could expect to be asked and told, that here's what this override is going to do, and it's part of a larger continuum of financial plan and financial needs, which will involve, to the best of our knowledge, future overrides of a certain frequency and order of magnitude. That's one of the things that's concerned me, and I know a number of other people, in the way overrides have been presented to date, and that almost the only thing that's relevant is what's being asked, and there's no context in the way of future needs or concerns.
Thank you.
That's meant to be a question. Is that consistent with the vision that you're offering?
I think the simple answer is yes. I think having information, having it in context is one of the things we recommend, and frankly is a challenge because people just looking at numbers without really understanding what that means there's no utility in doing that.
Scott Mannion, town meeting member, precinct 10. So I'd like to applaud briefly the idea behind the summit recommendation, and just encourage you to set your sights broadly on public engagement and community engagement as a whole. My fear would be that this summit would be well attended by the same 230-ish people who go to town meeting, and that it wouldn't increase the overall transparency to the general public of the budgeting process. And it seems to me that that's when we talk about override fatigue and whatnot, what we really need is for the town as a whole, the voting public who are going to go to the polls to vote on an override, to have confidence and trust in the people who set the override and in the methodology that created that override. Building that trust takes a lot of work. It takes individual talking to voters and making sure they turn out eventually. And so I think I like that bullet point in your recommendations, and I would just encourage you to view it even more broadly, that ultimately what you need to do is educate the entire town. And some of this is as you say, for an override study committee to set a regular pace and schedule and whatnot, perhaps will help. But ultimately, what it comes down to, the other aspect of that is going back to that slide about potentially unfunded mandates at town meeting. I note that only 3 of those items were actually bylaw changes: the Oak Street property, the menstrual products, and the fossil fuel, which were not, of which Oak Street was by far the largest cost. But what I see that is an expression of town meeting about priorities, which are political priorities, but they're coming to town meeting because they feel like they're not being expressed and pursued in the regular budget process, that something's gone wrong, we're not meeting our fiscal obligations, we're not meeting our political obligations either. And so ultimately, again, voters will turn out for an override if it's funding something that they actually care about. And part of that is increasing the transparency of the process so they can see the budget is funding the things which they care about, and that it's also meeting our fiscal obligations as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Well, just in closing, if we could. So thank you for coming out tonight, for your thoughts and guidance. It's extremely helpful. I want to say something about Mel Kleckner, the town administrator, who really helped us through this. Melissa Goff, Ben Loomis, Mary Ellen Norman. These people are doing a job that I will only say for myself is really difficult. Extremely difficult. That said, they have already started to do, on a note of optimism, some of the things we've talked about tonight. There's a piece of software called OpenGov that basically Mary Ellen and Melissa are already, respectively, are sort of CFOs of the town and school, are already starting to implement for us, that will get to some of these questions around more transparency publicly. How much of my taxes are the debt exclusions, things I would otherwise have to ask somebody around this table. You'll be able to see publicly. More importantly, it puts the town and schools in a position where they can do some of the most fundamental things together, like the record, of how the accounts get organized in this organization, which is the chart of accounts. In our report, there is a glossary of terms. I think we're up to, I don't know how many, 50, 60 terms that anybody who wanted to, I'm not saying you would, but if you're out there and you're one of us who aren't in the government, but you do want to understand what is being spoken about, the terms are in there, and we've defined them in as layman a way as we can. So the report is much more than what we talked about tonight. I think it's important that you do read it when it comes out. And again, I just want to say how grateful we are to all of you and how proud we are to be citizens of the town of Brookline.
David, I'd just like to interject my thanks to Select Board Member Franco for his care and support of this committee. Amidst all of his other responsibility, he has spent a tremendous amount of time with us, and it's greatly appreciated. And I wanted to ask Ben if he wanted to make any remarks.
Oh, thank you.
I will simply say, echo the praise that this committee has gotten. You've spent a tremendous amount of time diving into complex issues and have produced some thought-provoking recommendations. And I think the conversations that we've had this evening, that have happened on the town meeting listserv in recent days on Facebook, is a sign of fulfillment of one of your chief missions, which is to unearth and to start a discourse about some issues which haven't been fully explored in recent years. So I hope that tonight is the start of numerous conversations, not only in the coming weeks and months as we approach May of 2020 when we take up the next town budget, but in the years to come as we talk about capital improvements and changes to the way we run our operating budget and make decisions in this community. So thank you.
Thank you.